You're listening to Trek FM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Roddenberry, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Are you taking all these books? I thought I'd take some light reading. Guess I got bored.
Welcome to Literary Treks, our books and comic show here on TFM. I am just one of the hosts here, Matthew Rushing, and I'm so excited to be back with the illustrious Chris Jones, coming from, well, the transporter room. So I guess you got a quick beam away, just in case?
I am ready. I'm ready to beam out. I'm ready in case my mission to extract Sulu is successful. I can quickly beam everyone aboard here. And I also want to assure you, Matthew, that this is actually me, not a primitive robot dressed in my clothing.
Oh, okay. I was wondering if that was the case. I just didn't know if you had a really good mic set up with the robot, or but I see that you're doing some movements and you're not doing the robot as you're doing them. So
well, these movements that you are witnessing now were pre-programmed by Scotty, and they will continue running until either I am killed by Klingons or I run out of energy.
Yes. So we could be here a while. So
yes, everyone, a few references to the book that we are going to discuss after our news segment.
Yes, it's going to be an interesting ride. So, so we'll be talking about the Fearful Summons there in our feature section, and we've got some news for you. So, of course, just getting back into the swing of things here with Literary Treks, and there's so much happening with the books and the comics of Star Trek, and we know that we've missed some comic reviews, especially for the Year 5 series that's been going on. So Chris and I are going to be getting back to that. We're going to have a monster episode. That's the news item coming up in October, because not only are we going to be doing these comic reviews, so we've got number 13, 14, and 15 for Year 5, and a special one-shot Hell's Mirror with none other than Khan in the Mirror Universe. We'll be talking about all of those, as well as a interview with Kirsten Beyer and her new book, To Lose the Earth, which we're really excited to finally be getting to. Just excited to have Kirsten back. So, yeah, this is going to be fun. And so be on the lookout for that. You'll want to make sure that you've read those comics as we will be talking about them in our next episode. So,
looking forward to those, especially Khan in a mirror.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see where they go with that. So that's actually, I think, a pretty interesting and intriguing idea.
Well, he's quite calm, I think, in the Mirror Universe, right? Doesn't he run an NPO?
Yes, and he actually has an NPR voice as well. So it's very strange. Yeah, no trying to take over the universe for him. So
he's just trying to make the universe a better place, Matthew.
Just one day at a time, Chris. Just one day at a time. Oh, goodness. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on Literary Treks. And, Chris, I think it's just time for us to dive into the Fearful Summons.
Or, as I call it, the Sexy Summons. Because there are moments in this book where I just stopped and just had to make a note at how people talk about things like the decon chamber in Enterprise, or some of the scenes that we've gotten in Discovery, or Boimler waiting naked in a shuttle pod on lower decks. And yet there are some moments in this book that made me say, oh my.
So, Chris, talking about the Fearful Summons, or AKA the Sexy Summons, this book is actually written by the co-screenwriter for Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country. So Denny Martin Flinn wrote this book. And so very interesting. Of course, this one is also following up the events of The Undiscovered Country in some ways, as all the crew of the Enterprise have either, they've been retired, or of course Sulu is still on the Excelsior. And
Uhura is a vice president of some company.
Yeah. So they're all in various different places. And so this book starts with and kind of revolves around the plot of Sulu and the Excelsior. They're out exploring, and they run into a ship that has a distress call that they're answering. And it's a distress call from some Beta Promethian traders who have run into a bit of bad luck, and all of their power is down, and are basically what happens is that they kidnap Sulu. So I first just had to ask for you, this ruse of the whole thing about their power being down and getting, Sulu and a few of his officers beam over to their ship to help them repair it. It seemed strange for Sulu to kind of fall for this kind of con this late in his career.
Yeah, I had the same feeling initially, but he does show some caution. He is a bit suspicious. He doesn't just buy the whole line right off the bat when they say, we've got 80 people over here. We need to beam over. We're going to die. We don't have food. Our life support's going down. He's a bit cautious. He does have them scan. But then he falls into the trap of going over there himself and taking the crew. And it's the moment when they beam over and they're immediately taken hostage that really got me, and is what you're saying, that he falls for it too easily. So, like so many things in this book, it's sort of a mixed bag where one moment the character is behaving in a way that you would expect, and then suddenly they're not. And in this situation, it all comes together essentially in one scene.
Yeah, it was, I think the thing that was strange to me, it just seemed like, even in Star Trek, you have the ability to obviously be able to scan the other ship, see if their main power is actually down. It's not hard to do. And it just seemed as though it was one of those things that, Sulu should recognize. It's like, in many ways, the power transfers are available. We've seen all sorts of things. So it felt like there should have been, at the beginning of this run-in with this distress-called ship and these Beta Promethians, that you should have run through a few more scenarios, a few more ideas, instead of just immediately beaming over and then getting yourself captured. And their whole goal in capturing Sulu is to try and basically con cargo out of the Enterprise, out of the Excelsior.
Right.
And, not really realizing that Starfleet ships don't really carry tons of cargo with them. I mean, they're not cargo transports. I mean, there's obviously things of value, but they're not, carrying around treasure chests of like pirate booty.
Yeah. Okay, so that's an interesting point. You would think that the Federation is well known, Starfleet is well known, so you would think that most traders would be aware of the purpose of a starship like the Excelsior. But in the setup, they don't seem to know that much about the Federation. Like, these guys are talking about, the Excelsior, it's such a big ship, it must have so much treasure inside. But then as the book goes on, the whole setup is based on how the Prometheans view the Federation. So that implies that they do know quite a bit about the Federation, and they should be aware. If they're worried about a military invasion of their world by Starfleet, they should be aware of what these starships are. So that's another case where, like, the whole premise of the story really flip-flops.
Absolutely. And not only that, but I mean, so the Beta Promethians also have massive dilithium crystal deposits on their planet. So they've been trading.
Yeah.
Now, these are there's an interesting setup with the Beta Promethians as a whole. I mean, and so that's something that's really interesting in this book. They have extensive dilithium crystal depositories, and they're quite rich, and they've kind of become space traders because of that. And they don't really create anything in their culture. They just travel around the galaxy trading dilithium crystals for everything they need. And so, and their society is broken into 3 different sections. They have clerics, they have a ruling family, and then they have this group called the shrewdest ones. And on the side, you have these pirates / traders who have taken Sulu and his crew. And it's fascinating because this society itself it's very interesting. It feels like if communist Russia and what we see as many of the Middle East countries, like say Iran, had a baby.
Okay.
And so, because you've got clerics, they have their own agenda. They want to replace the ruling family. The ruling family and the clerics also want to create a complete theocratic state where they themselves are the head. Of course, the ruling family doesn't want any of this, but they're also the ones who are controlling the dilithium profits, and it doesn't really filter down to the rest of the people. So they're the ones that have most of the power, and then you have the shrewdest ones who are working with the Klingons, most likely the same Klingons who were behind Gorkon's assassination. And they're trying to convince the people that Starfleet and the Federation are the enemy. And so you've got all of these different factions working behind the scenes. And then you've just got these pirates or traders who've turned themselves into pirates by taking Sulu and the Excelsior crew, or some of them, hostage. And it's just this one big mess. And what it kind of reminded me of was the end of the Cold War, where you have such a mess in the Middle East area as well as in Russia, where everything's fallen apart, and you have all of these factions that are vying for power, and nobody truly has a real clear idea of what's going on, because, you throw the Klingons in there too, and you've got this faction of Klingons who are trying to instigate another war, basically the same way they did in Star Trek VI. So it was a really interesting society, and I wish there had just been more. There had been more with that. I felt like they set up some really interesting ideas. Flynn has some really great ideas here, but it doesn't ever truly, I feel like, get fleshed out in a way that it could have gone from interesting to really great.
I mean, there are interesting ideas in here that could be explored, I think, more effectively if the parallel with our own world wasn't so on the nose. So you mentioned it's like if communist Russia and the Middle East had a baby. To me, it's even clearer than that. It's just pretty much, because the timing of this book, it's 1995, I believe, correct, when it was written. And it's so soon after the first Gulf War. And it really feels like this Beta Promethean society is simply the Middle East. And you do have this situation in the Middle East where you have ruling families, you have governments, then you have, there's the whole religious angle to this story. And clearly Flynn seems to be comparing the Western view of Islam and the traders that capture Sulu and the Excelsior crew behave very much like one of the radical terrorist cells in the Middle East that is not acting on behalf of a government. They're acting on behalf of themselves, their own ideology, and they want to extort. In this situation, the Federation being the United States, they want to extort them for money or for some other kind of reward. And there's this kind of mixture between that and also the desire to push the belief system. And the book seems to want to talk about how on Earth we can't get along as different groups of people, and our belief systems are always in conflict with one another, and that's holding us back. But I personally would prefer to see him do that with a little bit more creativity instead of it feeling so much like it's almost lifted out of the newspaper. It's like a ripped from the headlines kind of story, especially at the time it was written, because we were just coming right off of that situation and that standoff between the U.S. and Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War. So it feels very much like that to me. And
well, and it's I think what you're saying too is like there's a difference between, you know, the traditional nature of Star Trek and what we did in Star Trek 6, which is very much an allegory for the end of the Cold War, because that had been something in Star Trek that kind of had been a picture of that for so long from the 60s onward. And so it really made sense to kind of bring that to a close and bring this crew and this culmination of all this storytelling to a conclusion with that by allowing Kirk and his biggest enemy to basically shake hands and then walk off into the sunset, you know, right off into the sunset. And he wants to do, I feel like, the same thing with this book.
Yeah.
And yet, I think, like what you said, it just feels like, one, it feels kind of messy because none of the parts with the Beta Promethians and all of their different factions are really giving enough time or detail to really dig into them, to not just feel kind of like cliched versions of the things like you're mentioning that we had just witnessed with the Gulf War with Saddam Hussein, the threat always of you know, Iran. So all of that stuff, it's just not nuanced enough or well done enough to really grab you.
Right. And the reason that the Undiscovered Country works really well is because the Klingons and the Federation are set up from the beginning, if you go back to the 60s when Star Trek began, as enemies, and the Klingons were meant to represent the Russian side, the Soviet side of the Cold War. And as you were saying, it's a slow motion process between the United States and the Soviet Union to get to the point where you have to get to Glasnost in the 80s with Gorbachev, which is where Gorkon comes from. Gorbachev and Abraham Lincoln combined is where the name comes from. And then you have the Chernobyl accident, which is Praxis in the movie. So you have these key moments that you can pull on for the story in a way that makes sense for these two sides. And it's also a very big picture. It's the big ideological standoff between the US and Soviet Union as these two superpowers and how they come together. And finally, they are able to find some kind of peace. They're able to come out of that Cold War. Now, today we're in a whole other situation, but for a while we weren't. When the Soviet Union ceased to exist in December of 1991, in the years that followed, it was a very different feeling, and it really felt like that we had come out of this standoff that had been going on for so long, and that's the feeling that you get at the end of The Undiscovered Country, and that works quite well. Whereas here, we're just kind of, we're playing around with how two sides that have been in ideological conflict with each other on a different level, very much on a religious level, which is not how the US and the Soviet Union were in conflict for thousands of years in different capacities. Obviously, the US hasn't been around that long, but Western Europe has. And there's been this conflict of ideologies for all this time. And each side views the other side with certain prejudices that are not necessarily justified because there's this lack of understanding. And I think that's a lot trickier to wrap up into a story like this without falling into the traps of those prejudices yourself as the writer. And a lot of the stuff when I was reading this, and I highlighted sections where I'm just reading what he writes and thinking that, yes, this is the American view of Islam, for example, on a very surface level, without trying to explore how the other side is thinking. And if you're going to talk about the faith, I think you shouldn't just talk about the radical aspect of the faith, but you should talk about the real faith itself.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it was interesting, and I think the thing is that, and I came away with is like he tries, but it's not quite where it needs to be, and part of that is by showing the different sides. Like there's the radicalized version of it, there's the institutionalized version of it, and then there are the people who they don't care, they're just trying to make a living. And then there are the ones who are legitimately trying to use it to start a galactic war here.
Right.
And so you have all of these different factions. And again, I think that's the smart part of not just painting it all with one broad brushstroke, if that all people are like this in this region.
Right.
It's just, again, this is one of the places where if you're going to do that, you really need to be diving into it quite extensively, and it would need to be a longer book to really be able to do that. And so, and I'll say, one of the things that I saw earlier, or saw in the book, and this was a part where I think bias from Star Trek VI that we saw come out in Kirk really stood out. It's still being a part of Starfleet. One of the admirals talks about, and this is a quote, he says, "In other words, we've brought the bastards out of their stinking, primitive, undeveloped past and into the future. We've given them resources beyond their wildest dreams just because their primitive planets happen to be sitting on a dilithium crystal mines, and we had to not to their demands and play patty cake with their leaders, when we really ought to do is fly up with a S-load," he says, "of starships and take the pious bastards over." Right. That sentence sounds like it comes from Colonel West and Admiral Cartwright, and it's like, that's the kind of thing that I was very surprised to read in this book, that was still something that was prevalent in Starfleet after the events of Star Trek VI.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. This story is set about 9 months after The Undiscovered Country. It's actually in the same year. And I think what that reflects to me is how long it takes to change views and change a prejudice. I wouldn't someone like Colonel West, I would not expect him to change his way of thinking after Kittimer. To be honest, I don't think that someone like him at that point in his life would ever truly change his views.
Oh, sure.
I think it takes generations to change. The other interesting thing about that section, and I remember reading that as well and highlighting it, is that it also sounds like something you might hear spoken by someone in the government or the military in the U.S. during this time period that this book was written, in reference to the Middle East, in reference to Iraq. You just replace dilithium crystals with oil, and you've got the entire scenario that played out at that time and in the decade that followed. And I'm certainly not saying that everyone thinks that way. I'm simply saying that there are people who think that way, just as we had Colonel West and the way that he felt. And
yeah, well, I mean, and what's fascinating about it is that attitude sounds like, I mean, it's not. I mean, we can't just say it's Americans, because I mean, you would have heard that same kind of refrain from top level Romans about the barbarians.
Yeah, right.
You know, like
exactly.
This is something that, like, I think that what he's getting at least with this, is that these deep-seated and rooted ideas of that we are better than these people,
right,
has been a part of human history, and not just human history, but I mean, one of the things we see in Star Trek is it helps us show that, like, beings of all kind have this problem, and it's a struggle to overcome that type of behavior or bias as we move forward.
Except for the Dolpheels.
The Dolpheels, no, they are in apparently a utopia / Eden. That whole section of this book was absolutely ridiculous, and I knew. So what he's trying to do with this like Dolpheel utopia is show that it is possible, I guess, to create utopia,
right? As
long as you don't intermingle with anybody else, I guess. Like, I don't know. It just did not work whatsoever for me.
It was interesting because it's used as the setup. It's not really the setup. It's just the mission that they're on at the beginning of the book. But then he comes back to it at the end to try to make the point about how on Earth, our cultures are constantly in conflict, but the Dolpheels have found a way to avoid that. And now they seem to be gone. And I actually wrote so long and thanks for all the fish in my notes, because it is like the dolphins left again, except these are dolphins on some other planet who, to go back to your comment earlier, it's as if a dolphin and an eel had a baby. They're the Dolpheels. But it was an interesting science fiction idea that like bookends this story, but is not explored at all. And I think it would be interesting to explore who are the Dolpheels.
And the thing about it is that they're trying to use, he's trying to use it to make a point about this, this idea of how difficult it is for different races and cultures from around the galaxy to interact and work with one another. And how on this Dolpheel planet, instead of creating any kind of technology or whatever, they're working on their mental capacities.
Right.
So that they're basically transcending, And I mean, it all sounds really good, but it just kind of comes down to like ridiculous mumbo jumbo. It's like, that is the most, that's where like science fiction to me, like kind of loses me, because it's like you've created an idea that's so utterly foreign to anything we know. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really make a ton of sense because like their planet is literally pristine. It's there's nothing wrong with it. Like it literally sounds like Eden. Mm-hmm. And so, but from what we understand of the galaxy, that's not even possible, to have a planet that's that perfect.
Yeah,
right. So, anyway, like it was just a little bit too much. Again, I think you said it when we were talking about the Beta Promethians and their whole society. It just feels so on the nose. Mm-hmm. There's no nuance to it.
Yeah. So I do want to comment. I keep mentioning the U.S. here, and it's not meant to be accusing the U.S. of anything. It's just that this particular story seems to be a Star Trek version of the events that were happening at the time the book was written, which were very specifically a standoff between the U.S. and Iraq. There's even the line in here where they talk about how they have surrounded the Beta Promethean space so that the Prometheans can't get any military out. The Federation has created a blockade and they're allowing humanitarian aid to come in and out to a certain extent. It's the situation is just being transferred over into a Star Trek book. And so that's the reason why I'm specifically talking about that. But then you get to the end and there's this comment about, how long do you think it'll take for us to resolve this kind of conflict amongst ourselves? And they say, well, it's going to take, they've been trying for ages. And that again is the situation of the attempts to find peace in the Middle East. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to say, Matthew, when you were reading that quote earlier about we've brought the bastards out of their stinking primitive undeveloped past into the future, we've given them resources beyond their wildest dreams and so forth, that I said that you can replace dilithium crystal mines for oil. But that's the other kind of the view. It's the short-term view, whereas actually that part of the world gave us many of the arts and sciences that we have today. You know, that the culture is very ancient, but it's something that is often not taken into account when we talk about other cultures.
Well, and at least the way this culture is portrayed, there isn't those. That we don't, I mean, we have no concept that they have any of those things. It just seems like
because the book doesn't explore it. But
right,
like
exactly.
you were saying earlier, he puts the pieces in place that he could have explored, that the culture is different. He even mentions militaristic Klingons at one point, which suggests that, yeah, there are different kinds of Klingons. You know, there are the
Right.
scientist Klingons and the mathematician Klingons and the doctor Klingons and all. He never goes into it, but he does make the point of mentioning specifically militaristic Klingons, which was interesting because normally we just think that all Klingons are militaristic.
Right. Right. So one of the big parts of this book is the fact that because Sulu has been taken, that Kirk is going to get the crew back together. And so we find them in retirement. And so I kind of wanted to ask you about, you know, the different places that we find. You know, we've got Kirk, Scotty, Uhura, Bones, Spock, and Chekhov all doing different things now that they're retired from Starfleet. And first off, you know, I thought it was really interesting because I felt like Kirk himself feels quite aimless there on Earth. He doesn't seem to be really doing anything.
Right.
Until he runs into this young cadet at a you know, apparently Starfleet seedy bar with Delton dancers, and they strike up a relationship.
Yeah.
And it just, what seemed strange is that it just seemed weird that Kirk would be aimless. Like, even in Generations, you know, in the deleted scene, you have him doing like the halo jumping, you know, from a starship down to Earth, that kind of stuff, thrill seeking, you know, like still trying to get that. Here, he just kind of seems like, I don't know, it didn't compute to me that Kirk would basically be doing nothing.
Yeah, that didn't stand out to me as much because another way of looking at Kirk, and this I think is how Flynn is approaching Kirk, is that he wants to be in space on a starship exploring. You know, his demotion at the end of the voyage home from Admiral to Captain was like the greatest thing that could ever happen to him because he gets to go back out there in space. Yeah, I think about my father. My father was basically a handyman. He loved building things. He loved doing things hands-on. And at one point in his life, he ended up with a desk job. And for a few years, he sat at this desk and he did this desk work. And then one day, he called me up and he told me that he quit and he was going to become a truck driver. And after that, he drove cross-country tractor trailer for a number of years. And then he was able to get it down to where it was more regional because cross-country in the U.S. is obviously very exhausting and you're gone for weeks. But he had to get out and be going somewhere. He could not sit at a desk. And that's Kirk, I think. And while in reality, Kirk would probably do something like, you know, go climb a mountain or do some kind of activities if he's on Earth. Another way of looking at it and portraying him, and I think it's probably done here for the setup of the story, why he jumps into action and goes. And because, to be honest, I can see Kirk being concerned about Sulu, but Kirk and Sulu, we never see them have such a close relationship. Like Kirk going to save Spock, to find Spock in the search for Spock, definitely. That, yes, he's not going to let Spock rot on some planet. But to jump into action to go rescue Sulu and not try harder to get something going through diplomatic channels, that I had a little bit of a hard time buying. And so I think Flynn is sort of setting up Kirk as being bored out of his mind on Earth and starting to feel down on himself as he's getting older, which is why he has this set up with this Barbara, this young cadet who he gets into a relationship with, which starts to kick off the many, many sexual moments of this book, which is why I call it the Sexy Summons. And then also why he gets the band back together and gets this yacht called the Plush Princess so he can go out back into space for one more mission.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that part made sense, that Kirk would be trying in some ways to recapture his youth with a
Barbara.
younger woman, and that would be a way of doing that, and kind of giving him that feeling of being young again. And if you're an older man, for a younger woman to be attracted to you is definitely an ego boost, and so Kirk wanting that and kind of needing that. And it's interesting because she legitimately does seem to have interest in Kirk. And I thought that was fascinating that within the book, you get this feeling like, because it looks like she might be doing something shady, and then the end, no, she hasn't been. And not only that, but the relationship that they have started before Kirk ever, had said anything to her about maybe wanting to go off and help Sulu. So This is actually a real relationship that they're having. And she seems to be interested and keen to continue that in the future, which, I have no problems with. But it is very interesting to me that, that she would be interested in Kirk in the first place. But I mean, I guess, he's famous, and he's kind to her, and I will say this, Flynn kind of plays around with the idea a little bit that Kirk has a girl in every port, and yet when you actually watch Star Trek, that's not Kirk at all. He gets the reputation of being like that, but it's not actually true. And so to see him kind of get into this relationship and actually be involved in it and want to pursue it was fascinating to me. And I think it was good, because that helps with changing the perception of Kirk, which that was nice. So it was a little more explicit than I'm used to, I guess. I mean, I don't really watch Discovery, and I know Discovery can get pretty explicit in its sexual scenes.
Not so much, really.
This seemed like, I don't know, a little soft-core-ish in some points.
I mean, we have to read this little section right here.
Oh, no.
I've
got a bad feeling about this.
Well, when Kirk goes into Mos Eisley, or the Flag and Grog, as it's called here in this story, and they describe it as a burst of starlight, and red, white, and blue lasers flashed in the giant mirror above the bar. It reflected activity throughout the large room. Low tones thundered out of speakers overhead. The surface of the mirror turned to glass, and behind it Kirk could see two humanoid forms. Then the glass turned to smoke. Lights dimmed throughout the bar, and the smoke began to clear, leaving the two figures standing on a mirrored stage floor, bathed in a red-orange glow. They made a handsome couple. The woman wore only a white satin G-string featuring the Starfleet insignia, spiked heeled glass shoes, and a string of Martian pearls around her neck. The man wore a black G-string pouch in the same shape, and knee-high leather boots. Both were Deltan, Kirk knew, the most erotic people in the galaxy. And you probably don't want me to read the next part because it gets a little more explicit.
Probably not. I think that we should try and keep this as a family show. So.
But this really stood out to me because you don't normally get quite this type of description in Star Trek. I think back to, say, Broken Bow, the pilot episode of Enterprise, and how erotic the butterfly the dancers with the long tongues and the butterflies was. Yep. And that was nothing at all like this. That was just sort of alien exotic, but it had this sort of kind of erotic nature to it. And this was really out there.
Yeah, it was a little too much. So,
but it's not the only time that we get something like this in this book.
No, because Kirk and Barbara's interludes with one another are they're not Game of Thrones level, but I mean, there's definitely, I mean, talk about Wretched Hive of Scum and Villainy. We get a taste of everything in this book.
Well, in the coda, Flynn even makes the comment that it appears that the Dolpheels are not yet ready for intergalactic intercourse. And I wasn't quite sure what he was referring to there.
I don't know. Let's move on. So we talked about Kirk and Barbara. What did you think of the rest of the crew here with Scotty and Uhura, Bones and Spock? And well, before we do that, let's just talk about Spock. I think the rest of them, it's kind of normal-ish maybe, but Spock is on Vulcan acting.
Right.
Trying to get in touch with basically his emotional side. Okay, no. This does not work at all.
Well, it made some sense to me. I agree with you in general. It doesn't work. But if you look at the Undiscovered Country, and again, this is 9 months later, if you look at the experiences that Spock had in the Undiscovered Country, he mind melds with Valeris. Valeris is very emotional. And if you look at just the events of that movie and how everything played out, and we know that from the beginning of the voyage home, essentially what we see on screen, the end of the search for Spock, that Spock is having to learn how to be in touch with his human side again and learn what emotions are again. And there's that scene where he tells Valeris, that logic is only the beginning of wisdom, not the end. I think it makes sense that Spock would be continuing to explore this aspect of his human side. And I feel like the whole thing of him being back on Vulcan, doing a Vulcan production of Hamlet, is just, and especially with Flynn being one of the writers of The Undiscovered Country, is a continuation of the Shakespeare theme from The Undiscovered Country. And Spock is exploring Shakespeare even more. So it's a bit odd, but it didn't come completely out of left field for me.
I do see what you're saying, obviously. And I think, obviously, you've got the connections with, the Undiscovered Country. Again, I feel like it's so on the nose. It's just too much. And and I think having Spock explore his emotional side, I think that's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think the problem with it is that it felt like the most un-Spock way to be exploring your emotions possible. And then it's kind of used in a joke-like manner later when he's doing makeup on them to make them look more like Klingons, which, that didn't make a lot of sense. There's a joke in there about Spock. There's a joke later about Spock going on vacation and getting his luggage lost.
Yeah, that was weird.
So there's so many things there with Spock that just don't compute as Spock-like. And, part of writing tie-in fiction, and strange that he's the co-writer for this movie, one of my favorite Star Trek movie of all time.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't seem to have a good grasp on the voices of the characters. And
at times, but then at other times he does.
Exactly. Yeah. There are times when that happens, but put it this way, there's that line where Kirk says to Bones, I don't make a habit of talking about my personal life with my subordinates, basically, people under my command. And it's like, that's BS, because Kirk has spent his entire career talking to Bones and Spock about his personal life. So it's like there are those moments like where they'll sound like that they are, and I think this comes down to the tone of the book. Like there are moments where things feel right on target, and then there are moments where it's like, I don't even think you knew where the target was when you were writing that. Like the line is a dot to you.
Yeah. Well, the comment you're talking about, I have it here, where Spock is talking to Scotty, and Scotty says that it's not like going to Mars for a vacation. And Spock says, I have been to Mars for a vacation. Really? Scotty said. What was it like? Mr. Spock paused to remember. They lost my luggage, he said. I'm sorry, Spock shrugged. I have not been on vacation since. Yeah, it doesn't sound like Spock at all, right? What I wonder is it supposed to be sort of like Spock when he was on Earth in the voyage home? That kind of trying to use like more everyday English in a way that just sounds really odd out of Spock. But if so, it's completely out of place in the book.
Well, and it worked then because he had just gotten back from the dead, and so he wasn't quite right in the head. You know, and like this is the Spock from, again, the Undiscovered Country who talks to Valeris and says that, you know, logic is only the beginning of wisdom. Like this is the I Ching of Spock at this point. So he should, and this is where I don't feel he needed that. I don't feel like Spock needed to go get in touch with his emotions, because I feel like Spock in the Undiscovered Country is very much in touch with his emotions.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I feel like this whole storyline is irrelevant and unneeded for the character, because that character was already in a very good place emotionally in the first place.
So what would you expect Spock to be doing 9 months after the Undiscovered Country? Do you think would it have been appropriate for him to be starting down that path of being a sort of ambassador, being involved in Federation politics in some way, or off on his own somewhere doing something other than Hamlet and learning how to do stage makeup?
I think that it would have been more realistic to have him working in some kind of capacity, like we saw. Maybe he's starting on his road to a reunification.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would have been really interesting. You know, something along those lines, that like that experience had made him see, you know, like, again, anything would have been better, I think, than him, you know, doing this very strange dance with acting.
Yeah. As for the others, again, I thought it was very, very cliche. We find Scotty in the Highlands of Scotland. We find Chekhov in Russia, right?
Right.
It's like if you and I retired and someone found us in a barbecue joint in the South eating ribs, you know, it's like, because we're American, let's put them there. Like, if Sulu had been on Earth, is he going to be in a sushi bar in Osaka? I don't know. It was just very, very cliche to like put everybody back in their supposed country of origin, especially when you get to the end of the book and Barbara asks Kirk, isn't San Francisco home to you? And he tells her, well, no, it's not, you know, and you know, Kenya's not home for Uhura, and Scotland's not home for Scotty. Space is our home. So in the beginning, he puts everybody in their countries of origin. That's where they're going to retire because they've gone back home. But then at the end, he says, actually, this isn't home for anybody.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I just, none of it really made sense to me. I mean, the biggest thing was like, Uhura is now all about making the Benjamins or the credits or whatever it is they make. There isn't even money in the 23rd century. You know, okay. Kirk even talks about that the monetary system, you know, we hear that in Star Trek 4, he doesn't carry money. There's no need for money, you know. And I didn't understand, too, this is one thing I never understand. Chekhov is the same age as Sulu. Why isn't Chekhov being given his own ship? Why isn't, I mean, like, Chekhov deserves his own ship. Like, he should be a captain at this point. Like, he has enough experience in Starfleet with the best crew in Starfleet. He should be just like Sulu and having, because he's younger than Sulu in Star Trek chronology. So it's like, he'd be primed to be a captain at this point. So that didn't make a lot of sense. You know, Scotty actually was the one. I know he's in the Highlands of Scotland, but Scotty retiring to like a place where he's away from the engine room kind of made sense, at least for a while, that he was somebody who wanted to slow down, and maybe just tinker with things on the side.
Remember, 9 months earlier, he had just bought a boat. So maybe he's got the boat there on a Scottish loch.
There you go. So
it makes sense.
Yeah. It's weird. So I did want to ask you one thing that I thought was interesting in this book, because the crew basically, we find out in the end that basically Starfleet, once they've found out through Barbara that Kirk is going to get the band back together and go after Sulu, that because they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, they can't actually intervene without starting some kind of intergalactic incident, that they're supporting this through Barbara and, allowing things to move forward. How did you feel about that? Did that work for you as that they were basically using them as the intermediaries? Did that part of the story work for you at all?
Yeah, I think so, because it is true, as it's portrayed in the book, that the Federation would... I say it's true. I think within the Star Trek context it's true that the Federation would not take military action on its own. And this is where the sort of parallel with what was happening at the time breaks down a little bit, because obviously the U.S. did take military action. The U.S. formed a coalition. The first Gulf War formed a large coalition of nations to take some action, so it wasn't like a unilateral thing. But I think within the Star Trek context here, the Federation would try to find a way to extricate its kidnapped officers, but do it behind the scenes. Now, how do they go about doing that? I think it's more realistic that they would probably have like a Section 31 type operation to go in and get them. But the book then couldn't be an original series book focusing on Kirk in that situation. So having them see that Kirk is concerned about Sulu and seeing an opportunity to sort of use Kirk to do this work for them behind the scenes, I think it probably makes sense, because that way there's no way that Starfleet has to get its hands dirty in this situation, because if Kirk fails, they can just brush it under the rug. Like Barbara said at the end, when the 3 starships came in and saved the Plush Princes, this never happened. It's completely off the record. And in the coda, later, it's, like a month later, Sarek is there. And they're talking about how the Beta Promethians decided to release the prisoners. And Sarek is saying, "Thank you so much for doing that. And the Federation's taking great note of your actions." And even then, like on a diplomatic level, of course, Sarek has to know what happened, I'm sure. But on a diplomatic level, they're still keeping it completely off the books. So I think it worked okay for me that they would do that. I do think in reality, they probably would have had like a more Section 31 type task force go in. They wouldn't have used a retired starship crew.
Well, to me, that whole part at the very end, the coda with Sarek, reminded me of the end of The Hunt for October, where the diplomats are talking together, and he's like, "You've lost another submarine," But
Right,
there's been this whole dance. They know what they know, and everybody knows what actually happened, but nobody's going to talk about it because we're just sweeping it under the rug. So all that really worked for me. To me, it kind of made sense that they would use Kirk, because Kirk is an experienced commander. I mean, he's been on the frontier. Like, all of these things Kirk is very used to doing, and the people that he's recruited are still some of Starfleet's best, really. So for them to then underhandedly support that mission through Barbara made complete sense to me, and it works within, obviously, the confines of the Star Trek universe. So I thought it worked as well as possible, and it kind of... It's something that you saw in the 80s and the 90s with governments doing with different operations of like supporting these areas, but like not really being
True.
them. So
yeah,
we're I think of that movie with Tom Cruise, American Made, where he's just a civilian who's running all this cash from the big drug cartels and everything, and so that you obviously think of the Iran-Contra deal kind of thing,
right?
All of that kind of stuff. We understand governments do things that we'll never hear about to get things resolved through all sorts of means. So this kind of made sense to me, and obviously the whole point is to get the band back together. So
that's the point too. What it makes me wonder is, well, first of all, when you get to the end and the revelation is made, then you think back to things like the officers on the starbase helping them load the weapons containers, onto the plush princes and all. And as you're going along, you're kind of worried, like, well, if this all falls apart, those guys are going to get in trouble. But then in the end, probably they knew the whole time what was going on. And even having unfettered access to the replicator was probably part of all that support as well.
Right.
So
right.
I think he did a good job of concealing that aspect of the story as you read and then revealing it at the end. It wasn't too transparent what was going on. I was worried that the whole Barbara as a conspirator storyline was going to kind of fade out at the end and like really not have any meat to it at all. So at least that was kind of built up at the end to have some meaning to it. I just think that, the examples you give are very true in the real world, although usually governments are supporting larger factions, not a group of 6 people on some kind of mission.
Right.
And the other thing I wonder is, was the Federation Council already starting to think about what can we do to get the Excelsior crew back? And then they just happened to stumble upon Kirk in the bar and learned that he was concerned and that he was probably going to take action. And then they decided, why don't we go this route instead?
Yeah, I mean, and actually, when you kind of hear from Barbara at the end and they kind of explains it all, that does kind of seem to be the way that they were wanting to do something, and then this opportunity presented itself, and they're like, well, we'll just go with Kirk because, honestly, there are very few people that would be better at this than him. So,
I would say that the opportunity just fell in their lap, but with the other stuff going on in that bar, I'm not sure if I want to use that wording.
Yeah, no, good call. So on that note, Chris, on that high note, I feel like it's time to rate The Fearful Summons. So where did you end up with this book as and in your ratings?
Well, I guess I'm going to have to give this book 2 out of 5 illegal water guns.
I think that's a fair rating. On Goodreads, I feel like I had said that I put 2.5, but as we talked about the book, it really is only 2 out of 5 seedy bar drinks, because it's because it's so wildly inconsistent. It's the lack of consistency in the tone that really hurts the book. I mean, I think the bones of the story are good.
Yeah.
What I feel like it needed was an extensive rewrite.
Yeah.
To clean it up and not just that, but to really get into the voice of the characters in a much better way than they actually do here. So
yeah, it does feel kind of like a first draft of a story idea that hasn't been refined by the writer or the editor to clean up those inconsistencies in voice, to add nuance to the ideas, to add nuance to the situations and the societies so that it's not quite so on the nose. I think that the idea is good. I think it does what science fiction does well, what Star Trek does well. I could picture it as an original series episode, but I do think that even as an original series episode, it would be less transparent, more nuanced, and probably to tell the story, I can see it as more like a Enterprise 4th season 3-parter type arc, so that you could have enough time to tell the entire story and flesh things out. I don't think you could do it in 52 minutes, but no, the concept is good, but the execution is a bit weak.
Yeah, I will, and I don't mean this to be derogatory, but honestly, I feel like this feels a little bit more like a fan fiction work you would find online than it does an actual novel, because of so many of the wild inconsistencies, which don't really just seem to make sense, Yeah, it's very interesting to me that this book was written by somebody who wrote my favorite Star Trek movie, and yet this is what we ended up with. Yeah.
Maybe the timeline for writing the book was rushed and there was not time to go back and refine it. I'm not sure, but there are inconsistent. I don't know. I don't have the print book. I only have the ebook. There are a number of typos in the book. There's a lot of missing punctuation, and they refer to memory alpha 3 times in the book. And the first time they call it alpha memory, and the next 2 times they call it memory alpha. So even that kind of little detail, which should be caught in cleaning up a story, is in there. And I know things were a bit more inconsistent in the mid-90s. The novels that we get today are much more polished, but these types of things do also kind of suggest that maybe this could have used a bit more time and attention.
So, Chris, that was a lot of fun talking about the Fearful Summons, and I'm so excited because, next month we have a killer show coming up with Kirsten talking through To Lose the Earth. I can't wait to be back in her Voyager series. As everybody knows, we're huge fans of hers and her books. And we've got some great comics we're going to be diving into. But I'm just really excited to be doing that, and it was fun to get back together to talk about a Star Trek book. Hopefully I think next month will be a much more successful book to talk about.
I think so. When you suggested we read this one, I've never read this book, so I thought, okay, yeah, let's give it a shot and see what it's like. And it's the first time that we've discussed a book together in a long time.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because, I read this book years and years and years ago, back closer to when it came out. So I really did not remember the story much at all, other than the fact that, Kirk goes to save Sulu after the events of the Undiscovered Country. And I'm interested because I would like to then cover sometime next year. We'll try and cover the last roundup that Christy Golden did, which is another book set after the Undiscovered Country, and kind of it'd be interesting to compare to see which one's better in the end. So
definitely, Matthew, I'm looking forward to that. So everyone, you've heard our thoughts on The Fearful Summons, and we'd love to hear yours. So if you'd like to share your thoughts on the book, there are many ways that you can do that. The best way is to join the Babel Conference on Facebook. That's our listeners group. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field, and it should come up. If not, just type the whole name, the Babel Conference. If you're a member, you know how to get there. But if you're not, it is a closed group. So you'll need to answer a few questions so that I can let you in. So please be sure to answer those. And then you'll find a post when this episode comes out, and you can join in the conversation there in the comment thread. You can also send us an email if you like. Go to our website at trek.fm/contact and use the form there. Choose to send to a show and choose Literary Treks, and that'll come to Matthew and me by email. You can also find us on Twitter, where our username is TrekFM, and we have a main page on Facebook also, TrekFM. And guess what? That's our name on Instagram also, so you can find us all around under that username, TrekFM. And if you'd like to help us keep these shows coming, we could definitely use your help. If you'd like to become an associate producer or just a supporter or take part in the roundtable discussions that we have with listeners and hosts, you can find out everything you need to know about that by going to Patreon at patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM. And find out everything that you need to know about how to support us over there. And I'd like to send out a big thanks to the associate producers of Literary Treks, Greg Rosier and Casey Pettit, for their support of the show and the network. Thank you so much. We really could not do this without you. So, Matthew, we've told people how to share their thoughts on the show with the network in the Babel Conference, but what do people want to find you? Where are you when you're not busy sewing a little Starfleet insignia onto your favorite G-string?
Oh, wow. Well, when I'm not doing that time-intensive task, you can find me over on Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, Vero under the name MattRushing02. Of course, you can also follow the 602 Club, which is TFM's part of the network devoted to everything that's not Star Trek, and we're now on Twitter and Instagram. So please follow us there. We'd love to be able to interact with you. We're sharing things, Christy and I, and talking about all the things that are going on in the entertainment world and the 602 Club. You can find me, of course, doing The Orb with you, Chris. When we get a chance, we talk about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And then, of course, the 602 Club itself, which is the show where we talk about everything that's not Star Trek here. So many great fandoms to talk about beyond Star Trek, so check that out. And then over on the Nerd Party Network, doing a couple of shows. One is called Owl Post, doing that with Drea Kaufman as we talk about Harry Potter one chapter at a time. And then you can also find me doing the rest of Negotiations with John Mills. It's a Star Wars podcast, and every week we're talking about a new Star Wars topic. But Chris, when you're not frequenting the most seedy bar in the galaxy, hoping to see your favorite Deltons perform, where can we find you?
Well, of course, I'm busy replicating contraband in the form of water guns to trade for hostages. But when I'm not busy doing that, you can find me doing some other podcasts here on the network. There's The Ready Room. That's my main show, which I do with Larry Nemechek. Most recent episode, we did a roundup of Lower Decks mid-season, and that's out there right now. I also have a Star Trek Universe podcast called Interphase, and I have a new episode coming up soon where Chris Chaplin and I are discussing serialization in Star Trek, specifically looking at Voyager and DS9 and how they compare, although we do talk about the overall franchise a good bit. And also there's The Orb, which you mentioned, which is our Deep Space Nine show. And I'm planning, work allowing, to do Notes from the Edge as Star Trek Discovery returns in October for its third season. So hopefully I'll be able to bring you that. Follow along as that story unfolds. And if you'd like to reach out to me on social media, the best place is Twitter. That's where I'm most active. My username is C. Brian Jones, letter C, and Brian with a Y. That's my username everywhere in social media. And then you can also find me there in the Babel Conference.
Well, we want to say thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, live long and read on.
You call that light reading? To each his own, number one.